In 1957, the U.S. Army officially phased out the M3 grease gun from frontline service. The infantry moved on, paratroopers moved on, support troops moved on. The military had newer weapons, better weapons, weapons that fired modern ammunition and held more rounds. American tankers kept the grease gun. Not unofficially, not out of sentiment. It remains standard issue equipment aboard American tanks. The M48 Patton, the M60, and the vehicles that followed. For decades after every other branch of the military had handed theirs in. Crews carried it in Korea. They carried it in Vietnam. Drivers of the 1st Battalion's 67th Armored were still being issued the M3A1 in the mid-1970s at Fort Knox. Drivers of the 19th Engineer Battalion carried it during the Gulf War in 1991. By then, the grease gun was nearly 50 years old. The men who fired it in Desert Storm were carrying the same basic weapon their grandfathers had taken into Normandy. The Army eventually replaced it, not because tankers stopped trusting it, but because the M4 carbine finally offered something compact enough to fit the same role with better ammunition and more rounds. To understand why tankers held on to an ugly, stamped metal submachine gun for half a century while the rest of the Army moved on, you have to understand one specific scenario. The one scenario that defined every tanker's relationship with their personal weapon from the first day they climbed into a Sherman until the day they climbed out of an Abrams for the last time. The moment the tank stops being a weapon and becomes a coffin. Every weapon on a tank is designed to kill the enemy while you're inside it. The main gun, the coaxial machine gun, the roof-mounted 50 caliber. All of it is built around the assumption that the crew is alive, the vehicle is running, and the armor is doing its job. None of it matters the instant a round penetrates that armor. In World War II, American tankers fought the Sherman, a vehicle that earned a grim reputation for catching fire when its armor was penetrated. The reputation was not invented from nothing. Early Shermans, with ammunition stored in the vulnerable sponsons above the tracks, caught fire in 60 to 80% of penetrations, according to U.S. Army studies. The Army eventually addressed it by moving ammunition to the hull floor and surrounding the storage bins with water jackets, a fix that cut the fire rate to roughly 15%. But throughout the war, in both the early dry stowage models and the improved wet stowage versions, a penetrating hit remained a potentially lethal event. When that happened, the crew had somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds to get out before the situation became unsurvivable. 5 men, through hatches designed to be sealed rather than exited quickly, with ammunition cooking off around them, in a vehicle that was also drawing fire from whoever had just knocked it out. The Army knew this. It studied it. It published a guidance document in the summer of 1944 called Combat Lessons, which advised tankers directly, be ready for the infantry role. The advice was not abstract. It meant that the men inside the most powerful land weapon in the American arsenal needed to know how to fight on foot, in the open, in whatever terrain their tank happened to die in. And to do that, they needed a weapon they could actually carry through the hatch. What a tanker carried out of that hatch was everything. His pistol was standard issue, the M1911A1, same as the infantry. But a pistol against a squad of enemy infantry in an open field, coming toward a crew that had just bailed out disoriented and likely wounded, was not a realistic answer. What the Army had put inside the Sherman alongside the crew was a submachine gun. Early models carried a single Thompson, but the Thompson was 32 inches long and weighed over 10 pounds. Getting it through a tank hatch under fire was its own problem. Armorer Russell Spooner, who worked with Sherman crews in Europe, described the M3's specific value with uncommon clarity. An M3 lifted above the hatch opening could spray the countryside with a lot of bullets in very little time. That, he concluded, would discourage a nearby enemy from interfering with men who needed to abandon their tank. That sentence is the whole story. The grease gun existed, inside a tank, for one purpose: to buy a burning crew enough seconds to get out alive. The Thompson's replacement inside tanks was not accidental. It was the result of a specific recognition that the Thompson, for all its reliability and stopping power, was built for a different kind of fighting than the one tankers faced. When the M3 entered service in late 1944, late-model Shermans were reconfigured to carry 5 of them. Not 1, 5. 1 for every man in the crew. The Army had thought carefully about the math. A 5-man crew bailing out of a burning tank into a hostile environment needed every man to be immediately armed and mobile. The M3 collapsed to under 23 inches with its wire stock folded. It weighed less than 8 pounds unloaded. It fit in a bracket on the turret wall, 2 mounted next to the tank commander and loader hatches, within arm's reach of the men who would need them first. That compactness was not a compromise, it was the point. Tank hatches are not designed for comfortable exits. They are designed to be sealed against shell fragments, small arms fire, and overpressure from nearby explosions. A man climbing out of one is moving upward through a tight metal ring while wearing a tanker's helmet and whatever personal gear he has on him. The commander's hatch on a Sherman measured roughly 22 inches across. The loader's hatch was similar. Neither was designed with a rapid dismount in mind. In that moment, a 32-inch Thompson with a wooden stock is a liability that catches on the hatch combing and costs a man the seconds he does not have. A folded M3, tucked under an arm or grabbed from a wall bracket in a single motion by a man who has practiced it in the dark, is what keeps him alive in the first 10 seconds after his feet hit the ground. The 45 ACP cartridge carried its own logic in this context. At the distances involved, a bailout scenario means the threat is close, often within 50 yards, often closing. The heavy, subsonic round hit hard enough to stop men reliably at the ranges where the fight would actually happen. The M3 was not a weapon for long-range engagements. Neither was the situation tankers were trying to survive. And the M3 worked dirty. Tank interiors are not clean environments. Hydraulic fluid, grease, carbon fouling, and ammunition residue coat every surface. The M3's loose tolerances and simple blowback system were specifically tested to function in conditions that jammed more precisely engineered weapons. The Armored Forces Board, when it evaluated the T-20 prototype in 1942, was one of 4 boards that signed off on adoption, and its approval carried the most weight for the tankers who would eventually depend on it. The grease gun's survival in armored units after 1957 was not institutional inertia. It was the result of every generation of American tankers arriving at the same conclusion their fathers had reached in Normandy. Nothing else did the job the M3 was built to do, in the space where it needed to do it. Through the Korean War, American tankers fought in M46 and M48 Patton tanks in terrain that was brutal on equipment and brutal on crews. The nature of the bailout problem had not changed. The tank could be hit, the crew could survive the penetration, and the men outside were still waiting. The M3A1 stayed. Through the Cold War, the Army positioned armored units in West Germany along what planners called the Fulda Gap, the route a Soviet advance was expected to take if the Cold War went hot. A veteran who served there in the early 1980s, crewing an M106 mortar carrier, later described the M3A1 being carried in vehicles across the unit. They fired it on range day once a year. Some of the guns were worn, but functional. The tankers would carry them on guard duty. They were, by then, weapons that had survived longer than the men carrying them had been alive. Through Vietnam, helicopter crews adopted the same logic armored vehicle crews had already proven out: a compact, reliable weapon that could be carried in tight quarters and brought into action immediately if a crash in hostile territory left the crew on the ground and on their own. The M3A1 appeared in this role as well, another version of the same calculation. What the Army tried to replace it with told its own story. The M14, adopted in 1957 as the general replacement for the M3, among other weapons, fired a full-power rifle cartridge that was far too powerful and too long for use inside a vehicle. It was absurd in the role the M3 had been built for. The M16 that followed was shorter and lighter, but still nearly 40 inches with a standard stock, and its 5.56mm cartridge was optimized for different engagement conditions than the short, brutal distances of a bailout fight. Neither weapon fit the rack designed to hold the grease gun on the turret wall. Tankers who turned in M60 tanks during the Gulf War period later described turning in the grease guns with them. The weapons were linked to the vehicle by its table of organization, not to the individual soldier. When a unit transitioned to newer equipment, the old grease guns went back into storage. Some stayed in service on support vehicles longer still. A Stars and Stripes article from 2008 noted the M4 Carbon was replacing the M3 submachine gun in select cases for vehicle crews across the Army. More than 60 years after the weapon had been designed as a wartime stopgap by an automotive company in Indiana. The weapon the Army had designed as a stopgap in 1942 had outlasted every intended replacement in the one application it was built around. The M3 grease gun's longevity in armored units is not a story about a military bureaucracy failing to update its equipment. The Army updated everything else. The main gun improved, the armor improved, the optics, the communications, the fire control. All of it was replaced and replaced again. The grease gun stayed because nobody found anything that did its specific job better within its specific constraints. In 1991, American tank crews rolled into Kuwait carrying a weapon designed in 1942. The M1A1 Abrams they crewed was the most lethal tank on the battlefield by a considerable margin. A vehicle that destroyed Iraqi armor at ranges the enemy couldn't even see, using thermal optics and a 120mm smoothbore gun that had no peer in that theater. Everything about American armor in Desert Storm was modern, except the personal defense weapon mounted in the crew compartment. That detail matters. The Army's procurement system is not sentimental. Weapons stay in service when they work, when nothing better has been found for the role, or both. The M3A1 remained aboard American armored vehicles for 50 years, for the same reason it had been put there in 1944. It was short enough to carry through a hatch, light enough to grab in a panic, reliable enough to fire without thinking, and powerful enough to stop the men trying to kill a crew that had just survived getting their tank hit. After the Gulf War, the Army finally replaced it. Not with a dedicated replacement, but by accepting that the M4 carbine, with its collapsible stock, was finally compact enough to fill the same role with better ammunition capacity and a modern optics rail. The grease gun's 50-year run in armor officially ended not because the weapon had failed, but because something had finally been built that fit the same space and did the same job. There is a category of weapon that gets judged on the wrong terms. Judged by accuracy at distance, by round count, by the cleanness of its lines or the sophistication of its mechanism, when the only thing that actually matters about it is what it does in the worst 10 seconds of the man carrying it. The M3 grease gun was never beautiful. It was never celebrated. The infantry gave it back when they were told to, and most of the military moved on without much argument. But American tankers understood something about the weapon that the people replacing it had not fully accounted for. The scenarios they faced were different from the scenarios that drove everyone else's procurement decisions. A rifleman fights on foot in open terrain. His weapon needs range, accuracy, and the ability to engage threats at distances measured in hundreds of yards. A tanker, when everything has gone wrong, fights from a standing start at arm's length, emerging from a metal tube into a situation that is already lethal, with whatever is in his hands at that exact moment. Those are not the same problem. They never were. And the Army's attempts to solve the tanker's problem with the same weapon it gave the rifleman kept producing the same result. A weapon that was too long, too heavy, and too optimized for a different kind of fight. The grease gun's designers had not intended it to outlast every weapon that replaced it. They had designed it to be cheap, fast to produce, and good enough for the job. It turned out that being good enough for the job, the specific job, in the specific environment, was sufficient to keep it in service for 50 years. Some weapons earn their place through excellence. Some earn it by solving a problem that nobody else bothered to take seriously. American tankers took it seriously. They had to. If that is the kind of history you are here for, subscribe. There is more coming.